at the edge of the Mediterranean, where the morning light touches the water with soft gold, a handful of cities once shaped the rhythms of trade, travel, and exploration. Their streets echoed with the creak of ships, the call of merchants, and the quiet determination of sailors ready to cross distant seas. These were the maritime republics of Italy: Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and Amalfi, small in territory, yet vast in influence. And for a time, they were some of the most powerful trading centers in the world. Today, we drift gently into their harbors, exploring not battles or conquests, but the daily life, slow growth, and steady exchanges that connected people across continents. In the early Middle Ages, Italy was not a single nation. It was a mosaic of duchies, counties, small cities, and foreign powers, each with its own traditions and languages. Amid that patchwork, a few coastal towns developed something different: a deep relationship with the sea. These cities were ideally placed between the markets of Europe and the ports of the Eastern Mediterranean. Over time, they learned to navigate shifting alliances, complex politics, and the unpredictable currents of the open water. What set them apart wasn't just their fleets, it was their independence, their merchant-led governments, and their commitment to trade as the source of prosperity. In Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and Amalfi, wealth didn't come from farming land or controlling large territories. It came from ships, sailors, and the steady movement of goods over long distances. These were cities that lived by the tide. Imagine walking along a dockside around the year 1200. The air carries the scent of salt water mixed with tar, wood shavings, and spices. Ships with tall masts sway gently at anchor while ropes creak softly in the morning breeze. Workers move crates filled with wool, olive oil, and amphorae of wine. A merchant might be inspecting bolts of silk recently unloaded from a ship that sailed in from Constantinople. Nearby, dock workers carry bags of pepper, so valuable that it was sometimes used like currency. At every port, you would hear a mix of languages: Italian dialects, Greek, Arabic, Catalan, and sometimes distant accents from the Black Sea or North Africa. It was a peaceful kind of busyness, not frantic, but purposeful. Everyone had a role: sailors preparing for weeks at sea, carpenters repairing hulls, scribes recording cargo lists, and harbor officials measuring goods for customs. Even the architecture reflected life on the water: warehouses with wide doors, narrow alleys leading directly to docks, counting houses perched above the streets where merchants reviewed their ledgers by lamplight. For these cities, the sea was not a barrier. It was a highway. Few cities were as unique as Venice. Built on a collection of islands in the lagoon, its streets were canals, and its houses rose from stone platforms driven deep into the mud below. Venice did not merely face the sea, it lived inside it. By the 11th century, Venetian ships traveled to every corner of the Mediterranean. They brought back glass, spices, fabrics, and metals. They carried out timber, salt, and their own beautifully crafted goods. One of the most extraordinary parts of Venice was the arsenal, a vast shipyard that operated with surprising efficiency. Some describe it as an early form of an assembly line. Workers specialized in particular tasks, and ships moved through stages of construction with practiced rhythm. The arsenal helped Venice build fleets quickly, allowing its merchants to stay ahead of rivals and maintain an impressive presence across the sea. But beyond trade and shipbuilding, Venice nurtured a tradition of diplomacy. Ambassadors were sent abroad with detailed instructions. Venetians kept careful notes about foreign customs, weather patterns, and harbor depths. knowledge that would guide their captains for generations. To walk through Venice during this era was to walk through a city that quietly measured the world, not by armies or borders, but by tides, wind, and the glimmer of distant markets. If Venice was the shimmering city of the lagoon, Genoa was its determined rival on the open coast. Nestled between the mountains and the sea, Genoa grew upward and outward in a tight cluster of stone houses, steep alleyways, and bustling markets. The territory around the city was limited, so Genoa's energy spilled into the water. Its harbor became the center of everything. By the 12th century, Genoa had developed a remarkable network of trade posts and colonies stretching from the western Mediterranean to the Black Sea. Genoese merchants sailed to Spain, North Africa, Constantinople, and the far reaches of Crimea. Where Venice excelled in diplomacy and systemized trade, Genoa excelled in finance. Genoa's bankers became known across Europe for their reliability. They developed early forms of credit, loans, and investment partnerships that allowed merchants to fund long voyages without carrying heavy bags of coins. This financial innovation helped them weather storms, both literal and political, that would have crushed smaller ports. The city's shipyards echoed with the steady rhythm of carpenters shaping oak and pine into sturdy vessels. Genoese galleys were famous for their speed, their range, and their ability to navigate both open waters and narrow coastal routes. In the markets above the harbor, you might hear brokers arguing softly over the price of wool from England or grain from Sicily. You might see spices displayed in earthen jars or rolls of brightly colored cloth carried through the narrow streets. Genoa wasn't as serene as Venice, nor as sheltered, but it was bold, enterprising, and fiercely determined to remain a power of the Mediterranean. Before Venice and Genoa dominated the seas, Pisa was already an experienced maritime force. Located along the Arno River, Pisa sat just far enough inland to be protected from stormy seas, yet close enough to the coast to serve as a natural trading hub. Tuscan grain, timber, salt, and wool flowed through its docks, while Pisan merchants sailed towards Sardinia, Corsica, and the distant shores of North Africa. By the 11th century, Pisa became known for its naval skill and shipbuilding. Its sailors were respected for their discipline and their knowledge of Mediterranean winds. Its carpenters crafted sleek vessels, ideal for long voyages and quick maneuvering. Walking through Pisa during its height, you might find shipwrights polishing newly built hulls, traders gathering goods for the next convoy, and travelers stopping to rest before continuing their journey inland toward Florence or Siena. Pisa's fortunes eventually dimmed as Genoa rose to prominence, but for centuries, the city played a quiet and essential role in shaping maritime traditions. It fostered early navigators, educated skilled sailors, and helped create the foundations for Italy's seafaring culture. Even today, beyond the famous Leaning Tower, the city carries echoes of its long relationship with the water, the river, and the steady rhythm of trade. Long before Venice or Genoa reached their height, the small coastal town of Amalfi carved out its own chapter in maritime history. Protected by steep cliffs and surrounded by bright, clear water, Amalfi thrived as a peaceful trading republic. Its sailors traveled to Egypt, Syria, and the ports of southern Italy. Its merchants brought home exotic goods, paper from the Arab world, spices from distant caravans, and fabrics dyed in deep, vibrant colors. But Amalfi's greatest legacy was something far less visible than ships or markets. The Amalfi Tables, one of the earliest known maritime codes in medieval Europe. This legal guide outlined how sailors, merchants, and captains should resolve disputes, divide profits, and conduct themselves at sea. The wisdom within its pages influenced maritime law for centuries, traveling far beyond Italy's shores. The town itself was a place of calm white buildings, narrow stone stairways, and gardens clinging to the mountainside. Its harbor, though smaller than those of Venice or Genoa, was alive with gentle movement, boats rocking softly, nets drying in the sun, and merchants discussing routes under the warm coastal breeze. Amalfi never built vast empires, nor did it strive for dominance. Instead, it contributed a foundation of knowledge and culture that supported countless sailors who followed its early example. Across all four republics, one shared passion connected them, an unending curiosity for the world beyond the visible horizon. Sailors studied the patterns of wind and tide, charted hidden shoals, and listened to stories told by travelers from distant lands. Navigational tools slowly improved. Early compasses, simple charts, and hand-drawn maps that grew more detailed with each journey. Trade routes stretched like threads across the Mediterranean, west toward Spain and Portugal, east toward Constantinople and the Levant, south toward Alexandria and North Africa, north toward the Adriatic and beyond. Merchants followed these pathways not for conquest, but for exchange. Every voyage brought new information, new goods, and new ideas. Ships carried not only cargo, but stories. The maritime republics were not powerful because of armies or large territories. They were powerful because of connection. Their ships carried goods that shaped daily life across continents. Some were luxurious, others ordinary, but each item played a role in linking one region to another. From the eastern Mediterranean came silk, soft and brilliantly colored; pepper, prized almost like treasure; cinnamon and cloves, carried in small bundles; fine glassware from the workshops of Syria and Egypt; delicate textiles woven with gold thread. From Europe, the ships brought wool from England and Flanders, lumber from the dense forests of the north, salt, essential for preserving food, metal tools, coins, and armor, wine and olive oil, staples of Mediterranean life. Each voyage was a moving bridge between different cultures. As cargo shifted in the ship's hold, so did ideas about food, clothing, craftsmanship, religion, and science. A merchant might return from Alexandria with a new spice, a story about desert caravans, and a recipe learned from a market stall vendor. A sailor might bring back new knots, new ways of reading the stars, or small trinkets carved by artisans in distant ports. Trade wasn't just economic, it was cultural, subtle, and deeply human. Behind the bustling harbors and distant voyages were thousands of ordinary people whose quiet work gave life to the maritime republics. Sailors spent weeks at sea, living in close quarters, sharing food, duties, and stories. They patched sails during storms, mended ropes in calm weather, and slept wherever space allowed. Despite hardship, many returned year after year for the pull of the sea, a mix of adventure and routine that shaped their lives. Captains were chosen not only for their seamanship, but for their judgment. They needed steady hands, calm voices, and an understanding of wind, current, and human nature. A good captain could make the difference between a voyage that returned safely and one lost to unpredictable waters. Merchants often never left the city, yet their influence stretched across continents. They negotiated with traders, invested in voyages, studied market trends, and balanced delicate relationships with governments and guilds. Ledgers filled their counting rooms, Neat rows of numbers telling the story of goods exchanged, debts settled, and fortunes won or lost. Shipbuilders worked in open-air workshops, surrounded by piles of timber and stacks of tools. Their craft required patience and deep knowledge of wood. A single ship might take months to complete, each plank carefully shaped, each beam chosen for strength. Artisans and dock workers of all kinds contributed to the rhythm of the port. Blacksmiths forging nails, rope makers twisting long strands of fiber, and coopers crafting barrels that would survive long ocean journeys. It was a world where every person's work helped guide a ship across the sea. One of the most important, yet often overlooked, gifts of the maritime republics was the creation of organized maritime law. Trade across the sea required trust, and trust required rules. Beyond the early Amalfi tables, each republic developed codes governing how profits were shared, rules protecting sailors' rights, systems for resolving disputes between merchants, and guidelines for navigating foreign ports. These laws allowed trade to flourish with fewer risks. A Venetian merchant could partner with a Genoese sailor, knowing that written agreements would be honored in both cities. Captains could settle disagreements using a shared set of principles recognized across much of the Mediterranean. This cooperation did not eliminate rivalry, far from it, but it created a stable foundation that allowed commerce to continue even in uncertain times. Over centuries, these legal traditions influenced modern maritime law, shaping how goods move around the world even today. The Mediterranean Sea in the Middle Ages was alive with movement, far more dynamic than many imagine today. Caravans from deep within Asia reached ports in the Levant. African traders carried gold and salt northward. European ships hugged the coastline, moving steadily from harbor to harbor. Amid all this, the maritime republics became essential hubs in a web of exchange. Their sailors learned to read weather patterns, to navigate dark nights with the stars as their guide, and to rely on instinct born from generations on the water. But the world around them was always shifting. New powers emerged, trade routes expanded further west and south, and political alliances changed like the tides. The republics adapted slowly, sometimes reluctantly, but always with an eye toward maintaining their lifeline, the sea. While many cities relied on force to expand their influence, Venice cultivated something much quieter, a network of careful diplomacy. Venetian ambassadors traveled across Europe and the Mediterranean carrying detailed instructions known as commissions. These documents outlined exactly how a diplomat should negotiate, what gifts to bring, which alliances to avoid, and even which rumors to report home. When ambassadors returned, they were required to deliver long, thoughtful speeches describing everything they had observed. The condition of foreign ports, the moods of foreign rulers, new taxes, new trade policies, and even the prices of grain and wool. These reports created a living archive of knowledge that gave Venice an extraordinary advantage. Captains could set sail with better information. Merchants could anticipate political changes before they reached the docks, and the Republic could adjust its strategies without needing vast armies or huge territories. In many ways, Venice expanded not with swords, but with information. Genoa's strength came from something equally subtle, a vast system of contracts and partnerships that tied families, merchants, and sailors together across long distances. These agreements were flexible. A merchant could invest a share in a voyage to the Black Sea, while another might finance a ship heading west towards Spain. Profits were divided according to risk, distance, and the value of the cargo. The system encouraged cooperation, even between strangers, and allowed Genoa to fund voyages that stretched across continents. Genoese merchants established small communities in foreign ports, often centered around a church, a warehouse, and a cluster of stone houses. Over time, these outposts grew into vibrant enclaves where local culture mixed with Ligurian traditions. A traveler passing through might see familiar red and white Genoese shields carved into buildings, hear Ligurian songs sung by sailors far from home, or smell the scent of home-cooked stews drifting from open windows. Genoa expanded not by conquering territory, but by building networks of people, each one helping maintain the delicate chain of commerce. Though each republic had its own strengths, all shared a deep understanding of the art of shipbuilding. Their vessels were crafted with precision and care. A typical galley had a long, narrow shape, ideal for speed and maneuverability. Cargo ships were wider, built with reinforced hulls to handle waves and heavy loads. Inside the shipyards, carpenters carved ribs from curved tree trunks. Blacksmiths forged nails and anchors. Painters sealed hulls with pitch, and rope makers stretched long fibers across courtyards to twist into strong lines. Ships were not merely machines. They were expressions of a community's skill, patience, and collective memory. Seamanship, too, was a craft passed down through families. Young sailors learned to tie knots, read currents, and trim sails long before they understood the mathematics behind navigation. Experience shaped them as much as training. On voyages, crews lived by routine morning tasks, simple meals, night watches, repairs, and quiet conversations under starlit skies. A sailor's sense of time followed the movement of the sun, the shifting of winds, and the sound of waves against the hull. The sea was unpredictable, but the sailors learned to move with it, never fighting nature, only adapting. In the heart of each republic were the markets, places where goods, people, and stories intersected. Venetian markets smelled of pepper, saffron, and curing fish. Scribes sat behind low tables, recording transactions with swift strokes of a quill. Glassmakers offered shimmering beads and vessels that caught the light like jewels. In Genoa, cloth merchants displayed rolls of wool dyed in deep reds and blues. Bankers weighed coins, tested their purity, and recorded loans in heavy leather-bound books. Sailors lounged on stone steps, trading news of weather and distant ports. Pisa's marketplace felt more intimate, filled with river traders, Tuscan farmers, and travelers moving between inland cities and the sea. It was a crossroads where goods from the countryside met goods from the Mediterranean. Amalfi's harbor markets were smaller, but rich with Eastern influences. Paper, perfumes, and colorful fabrics brought by sailors who navigated bold routes across open water. Each market was a heartbeat of the Republic, a place where commerce felt almost like a living conversation. Life in the maritime republics wasn't defined solely by trade. Community rituals, feast days, and religious traditions shaped daily rhythms. Church bells timed the workday. Festivals celebrated patron saints of sailors and merchants. Guilds, associations of craftsmen, and workers provided support during illness, old age, or hardship. In Venice, elaborate processions glided across the canals. In Genoa, great churches were built with alternating stripes of black and white stone. Pisa's Cathedral Square became a symbolic center of civic life, filled with art, sculpture, and architecture reflecting centuries of pride. Amalfi's mountain paths led to quiet chapels overlooking the water, where travelers paused for reflection before beginning difficult journeys. These communities understood the uncertainty of life at sea. Their rituals offered comfort, continuity, and a reminder that every voyage, every departure, and every return was part of something larger. The maritime republics did not rise overnight. Their strength grew slowly, carried forward by generations who studied the sea as carefully as others studied books or law. Children in coastal neighborhoods often learned the basics of seamanship before they learned to write their own names. They watched older sailors tie knots, listened to their stories of storms and calm waters, and followed them down to the docks where ships rested at anchor. Over time, these young learners absorbed the quiet rules of the sea: how to judge wind direction by the feel of air on the skin, how to listen for changes in the waves, how to sense when a storm was coming long before clouds appeared on the horizon. Even merchants, those who rarely left the harbor, grew up with a familiarity for tides, currents, and the conditions that shaped every voyage. Knowledge wasn't just recorded in books, it lived in the people. Long before modern communication, the Mediterranean had its own system of information flow. Sailors exchanged news at taverns and docks, caravans brought word from inland routes, messengers crossed city-states with letters containing market reports, warnings, and personal stories. In Venice and Genoa, the arrival of a ship was an event. Harbor criers announced where it had come from, what goods it carried, and whether the voyage had been smooth or troubled. Merchants gathered to hear the latest updates, adjusting their prices or preparing new expeditions. Ship captains shared not just trade news, but stories of weather patterns, shifting sandbars, and navigational hazards. For the maritime republics, information was as essential as cargo. It allowed them to anticipate shortages, seize opportunities, and avoid dangers that could ruin a voyage. Even in times of conflict, communication persisted. Rival cities might compete fiercely, but they still existed within the same shared sea, one that demanded cooperation, respect, and awareness. As voyages grew longer and trade more complex, the demand for better maps increased. Monks, scholars, and sailors collaborated to create portolan charts, detailed navigational maps covered in a web of lines showing sailing routes, compass directions, and coastal landmarks. These charts were practical tools, not works of art. They depicted harbors with remarkable accuracy, showing bays, reefs, shoals, and the shape of coastlines. A captain studying a portolan chart might see the depth of a particular harbor, the angle of a dangerous inlet, or the location of a safe anchoring point. Mapmakers in Venice and Genoa became renowned for their craft. Their charts traveled widely, influencing navigators from Spain to the eastern Mediterranean. Though the world they depicted was far smaller than what would later be discovered, these maps represented a profound achievement, a shared understanding of the sea, built through observation, memory, and the careful work of generations. A voyage in the medieval Mediterranean was not always dramatic or dangerous. Most days were filled with simple, repetitive tasks that created a steady rhythm on board. Sailors mended sails, checked the rigging, cleaned the deck, and helped prepare meals. They stood watch at all hours, scanning the horizon for land, ships, or shifting clouds. Meals were modest, often bread, dried fish, olives, beans, and water stored in wooden casks. But there were also rare moments of peaceful beauty, the soft glow of dawn, rising over the water, the gentle rocking of the ship. At anchor, the sound of waves tapping the hull like a quiet drum. At night, Sailors told stories to pass the time. Tales of storms survived, distant ports visited, and rumors that floated between cities. Some stories were true, others stretched beyond belief, but all were part of the culture of the sea. These small routines, the work, the meals, the conversations, created a sense of belonging. Each crew became a floating community, bound together by shared duties and the vast, open horizon. While the maritime republics were centers of Italian culture, their influence reached far beyond the peninsula. In every port, sailors encountered people from other worlds: Arabs, Byzantines, North Africans, Iberians, and merchants from inland Europe. This constant interaction created a subtle blending of traditions. A Venetian artist might incorporate Eastern motifs. A Genoese cook might use spices learned from traders returning from Alexandria. A Pisan sailor might share stories he heard from Greek captains navigating the Aegean. The Mediterranean became a cultural mosaic, shaped not by force, but by everyday encounters. The republics thrived in this environment, absorbing new ideas and offering their own in return. Their ships carried not just goods, but ways of thinking that slowly transformed the societies around them. The maritime cities of Italy didn't just look like places of trade, they felt like them. In Venice, buildings seemed to rise directly from the water. Narrow canals reflected soft light between rows of arched windows and stone balconies. Warehouses were built with wide doorways facing the waterfront so that boats could unload goods directly into the lower floors. The city's bridges, graceful and practical, connected islands into a seamless whole. As waves lapped quietly at the foundations, Venetians moved through their city as if walking through a floating marketplace. In Genoa, architecture hugged the steep hillsides. Tall, narrow houses stood shoulder to shoulder, painted in warm reds, yellows, and ochres. Lookout towers rose above the rooftops, giving merchants and sailors clear views of the harbor and surrounding coastline. The streets were a maze of alleys, cool, shaded, and always leading downward toward the sea. In Pisa, the river shaped the city. Boats lined the Arno's edge, and broad quays served as gathering places for traders. Though Pisa is now remembered for its famous Leaning Tower, in medieval times its riverfront was equally iconic, filled with the movement of goods, traveling inland and out to the coast. In Amalfi, architecture clung to the cliffs in terraces. Whitewashed houses overlooked the bright blue water, while narrow stairways connected the town in winding paths. From higher points, you could see fishing boats gliding silently over the calm waves. Each republic's buildings reflected centuries of adaptation, communities shaped not by land, but by the rhythms of tides and trade. The maritime republics didn't exist in isolation. They grew through relationship, contact, and exchange with older, sophisticated civilizations. From the Byzantine Empire, they inherited advanced ship designs, diplomatic traditions, luxury goods, and artistic styles rich in gold and deep blue. Venice, in particular, developed a close connection with Constantinople. Its merchants lived there for generations, learning new techniques and bringing home influences that shaped Venetian art and architecture. From the Arab world, they absorbed navigational knowledge, mathematical ideas and new spices and crops, and early scientific writings. Amalfi, positioned closer to the Arab trade routes, became a gateway through which these ideas entered Europe. The city imported paper, a rarity at the time, which eventually helped transform record-keeping and scholarship throughout Italy. The Mediterranean was not divided into separate worlds. It was a place of constant movement, where knowledge flowed more freely than borders. The maritime republics thrived because they listened, learned, and adapted. Every aspect of life in these republics, shipbuilding, trading, banking, crafting, relied on the quiet support of guilds. A guild was more than a professional association. It was a community with its own rituals, rules, and sense of identity. In Venice, shipbuilders belonged to the Arsenalotti, a proud and disciplined workforce whose skills were among the most respected in Europe. Glassmakers formed powerful guilds on the island of Murano, where techniques were guarded closely and passed down only to trusted apprentices. In Genoa, merchant guilds helped regulate trade, ensuring fair practices and honest accounting. Bankers, too, belonged to associations that maintained stability in financial dealings. Pisa's guilds brought together craftsmen, navigators, and merchants, creating a system where knowledge was shared, disputes were resolved, and young workers were trained for the future. Guilds provided structure in a world shaped by uncertainty. When storms wrecked ships or political tensions disrupted trade, guilds supported their members through hardship. For many, guild membership was not just a job, it was a lifelong identity. Despite the hard work of daily life, the maritime republics found many reasons to celebrate. Festivals brought color and music to the streets. Ships were decorated with banners. Public squares filled with markets, performances, and ceremonial processions. Venice's famous celebration, the Festa della Senza, honored the city's symbolic marriage to the sea, a ritual that traced back centuries. A specially adorned boat sailed into the lagoon, where leaders cast a golden ring into the water to mark the union. In Genoa, feast days for patron saints were occasions for shared meals, song, and moments of reflection for sailors preparing for long voyages. In Amalfi, smaller but equally heartfelt festivals marked the return of fishermen, the blessings of the sea, and the bonds of community. These rituals reinforced a shared truth that life was tied to the water, sustained by it, and dependent on its moods. Celebrations honored not just faith, but the sea's generosity. No power lasts forever, and the maritime republics faced challenges that slowly shifted the balance of the Mediterranean. The rise of powerful nation-states changed the political landscape. New oceanic routes, especially those opened by explorers traveling west and around Africa, diminished the importance of Mediterranean trade. Larger kingdoms with expansive territories and stronger military resources began to dominate global commerce. The republics didn't vanish overnight. They adapted as much as they could, continuing to trade, negotiate, and innovate. But the world around them changed faster than their ships could sail. Still, their cultural legacy endured in architecture, law, navigation, and the very shape of Mediterranean history. Though the maritime republics eventually faded from political power, their influence continued to ripple outward across the centuries. Their early experiments in credit, commercial partnerships, and maritime law helped shape the systems that later powered global trade. Their navigational knowledge guided sailors long after their flags disappeared from the Mediterranean. Their architecture, Venetian canals, Genoese alleys, Pisa's riverfront, Amalfi's cliffside terraces, still reflects a world built by and for the sea. Even today, walking through these cities, you feel traces of their maritime spirit. The way sound echoes between narrow stone walls, the scent of salt carried on the breeze, the slow turning of boats in quiet harbors. The past lingers softly, like the memory of a long voyage. Imagine standing at the edge of an old quay at dusk. The water settles into gentle ripples. Shadows grow long across the surface as lanterns flicker to life along the waterfront. It was in moments like this, between the rise and fall of tides, that the maritime republics found their identity. Sailors preparing for departure looked to the horizon with a mix of hope and caution. Merchants examined their ledgers while listening to the distant calls of the harbor. Children watched ships gliding in, wondering what distant lands they had come from. These were communities built on curiosity, on the belief that the world was wide, connected, and worth exploring, on the understanding that each voyage, no matter how small, contributed to something larger. Today, we trace those same waters in our imagination. We follow the quiet roots of medieval traders, the gentle rhythm of shipbuilders at work, and the soft hum of harbors that never truly slept. As we leave the world of the maritime republics, the Mediterranean returns to its timeless calm. The sea that carried their hopes, their goods, their ships, and their stories still moves with the same steady breath it held centuries ago. Waves touch the stone foundations of old docks. Boats drift slowly in sheltered bays. The wind carries echoes of languages that once mingled freely across busy marketplaces. In this quiet, the legacy of Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and Amalfi endures, not as empires, but as reminders of how people once connected across vast distances with patience, skill, and imagination. Their cities may no longer command the Mediterranean, but the spirit they built upon the water lives on. In the maps we use, the trade routes we follow, and the shared history that binds the world. Thank you for drifting through this journey. May the gentle stories of the sea stay with you, like a soft tide, returning again and again to shore.